Welcome. This is Leading with Spirit, the show that gives you an in-depth look at topics like what it takes to navigate your spiritual journey, how to heal yourself and grow your spiritual gifts, and balanced practices to expand your business and your spiritual leadership. I'm your host, Spirit Bird, shamanic teacher, healer, and author, here to guide you on your journey to becoming your most potent spiritual leader. Have you been hearing the call to expand your spiritual gifts and step into your next level of conscious leadership? If you're a coach, healer, or a spiritual leader, you can learn more about shaman school and growing your spiritual business on our website, holtonhealingarts.com, or send me a DM at Holton Healing Arts. It's almost Halloween, and I thought, what better time than a time for ghost stories? So I remember when I was little, I would see ghosts or beings sometimes around the house. Often I would see them kind of in the shadows. They would hang out on the edges of the woods. Sometimes there was one in particular that would rush kind of past my door in the hallway at nighttime. Sometimes I could sense beings on the other side of the house when I would walk around at night. It was really years later when I began my shamanic training that I started to realize that some of them were spirits. Well, they were all spirits. Some of them were ghosts. Throughout my early training, I learned about psychopomp work. So if you're not familiar with psychopomp, that term, it actually comes from a Greek word. And the term is now applied to people who essentially help lost souls cross over. Originally, it was like a deity that did that work. And I've always been really fascinated with it because I'm a traveler myself. I work in between realms. And so even though I didn't come here to do psychopomp work, I do include it in my work, I include it in my teaching. And it's a place that I've always been really fascinated with. So ghosts can occur for a few different reasons. They are in almost every tradition. And there is almost always a transition time between when someone or something dies and when they are actually like crossed over into the beyond, whatever you use to determine what that place is. So because of this, because there's this gap in between when you die and when you cross over, sometimes they don't cross all the way over. And it can be for a number of reasons. It might be because they have unfinished business in this life, right? Something that they were really invested in that they want to see to fruition, or something that's unfinished with a loved one or a relative. It can also be because people that are still alive on this side of the plane actually haven't let them go yet. Sometimes we actually unintentionally sort of hold part of their soul here on this side. Usually it's because we love them so much and we're not quite prepared or available for actually grieving their loss. And so we actually keep them here. It can also be because of addiction. Sometimes addiction will keep people from crossing all the way over. And oftentimes it's actually from shock when, a person or an animal dies suddenly and unexpectedly. They might not actually realize where they are. They didn't actually know that they died. If you are working with ghosts, we'll definitely get training and definitely be clear with your spirit guides if you have permission to work in this way. And if you are working with ghosts, it's likely that that's part of your gifts and part of your work here in the world. If you have a lot of experiences with ghosts, it's likely that also this is part of your work in the world. So again, with me, it's less that I'm here to do psychopomp work, but because I tend to work in the in-between realms, I'm a pretty good guide for folks that are psychopomps. And that's how I've found myself landing in this work. And so I had training earlier on. My first experience with the Psychopomp work was meeting with the ghost of my friend's dog. The dog had died suddenly and tragically. And because of the shock of the dog and my friend, and how much my friend loved the dog and was not prepared to be losing him, that even 10 years later, my friend still had a big attachment to this dog. He would still tear up when he talked about him. He really just wasn't available to let him go. So I, with some training, asked to meet with the ghost of his dog and had a conversation with him, helped him understand what was happening to him. And with permission from my guides, helped him cross over. And then it turns out that same day, my friend reported to me, he suddenly felt free from the loss, like a weight was lifted off of him. And he didn't know that I had been doing the work that day. So you can see the direct connection here. And to be clear, again, I was also very clear with my guides about having permission to work with the spirit in this way, because it can be tricky when you have souls enmeshed in that way. So some people have the natural ability to attract ghosts. Again, likely if it's part of your gift, then you're going to have more experiences with ghosts in your life. It's kind of like one of the side effects of the gift. Well, it's a big part of the gift, really, because you're created for this role. And if you are, then you're going to see them more. You might get messages about when people are going to die. Or you might have a tendency to end up in places that are haunted. For many people, their gifts actually open up after they lost a loved one. Even if you're not doing work with ghosts, most people, the majority of people, have that kind of awakening after the passing of a loved one. Partially because when you lose somebody that you're that close to, the veil will stay very thin for a while. And so if that's the case, they're going to communicate with you. And I find that even the most resistant of people to the energy world and spiritual work will find in these situations that it's undeniable when they can feel that loved one, actually communicating. It's so clear. And sometimes they're going to communicate through messages in your thoughts, and sometimes they're going to communicate through the physical realm. This is true. One of my students in particular, she definitely had a gift. And in particular, the gift was the way the ghosts would interact with her in the physical plane. Now, obviously, ghosts are in between anyway, so they do have the ability to interact in the 3D. But I've never seen anything like this. Dropping open books in front of her that would have messages, playing songs, tripping songs on the radio. One day during shaman school, we were doing some Psychopomp work, and that person was sent a package to their door in the middle of our session, which at that time was late at night, with the words fragile on it, letting us know to handle this particular being with care. I dated this man years ago who was super close with his grandpa. And when his grandpa died, he had the opportunity to become a caretaker of his grandfather's land. There was a small house on the property, and the bulk of their property was wild and used for hunting. It was their hunting camp. And we had been courting, creating a farm out there. And so, of course, one day he invited me to check it out. And I remember it so clearly walking into the house. He took me through the kitchen. It was like a small, kind of southern little bungalow. And, it probably stayed the same for decades. And the kitchen was small and cramped and had, some boxes and some things kind of stacked up. The floor feels like it was that kind of like vague yellow linoleum. And then in the living room, the lights were out in there, but there were two sort of like old grandpa chairs and this old like brownish, reddish carpet. And as soon as I walked into the living room, I could feel the intensity of his grandpap's presence there. It was just like same thing. It was just so undeniable that he was present still. So when I walked in with that awareness, I paused because I wanted to acknowledge it. So I, said hello to him. I realized, became acutely aware that I was in his home, so I thanked him for welcoming me into his home. I assured him that I came with respect. And that I'd heard many wonderful things about him. I was grateful to be in his presence, even if it was in this capacity. And I wanted him to understand that his grandson had full intentions to honor him and his wishes with his property. And I remember it was like after that, my friend had noticed me standing there, and this whole interaction was over a pretty short period of time. And he's like, why are we standing there? And I told him how present I felt his grandfather. And I remember questioning whether I should share that or not, but I asked if it felt like it served, and I got a yes. And I think it did. I think that my friend was relieved because he could feel him too, So there was a place where he was validated in his own knowing, where the connection that he thought was there got to feel true for him too. Right? And that was kind of meaningful. And at that point, the passing of his grandfather was still pretty fresh. And I think his grandpa wanted to stick around to make sure his property was going to be tended in the way he wanted. And once that worked out and was off and going, and, the family that was closest to him, grieved his departing. The next time I came out to the house, even though nothing had changed in the house, it was clear the energy was completely different. It was clear to me that his grandfather had moved to the other side. He had gotten permission or felt comfortable enough to let go and move on, right? He had what he needed to move on, and the family had healed or got what they needed as well. And I remember also going back again and my friend asking me, checking again, do you still feel him in here? And I said, no, I don't. And there again, my friend was pretty satisfied to hear that, because I think he felt the same. He felt the weight of some of the grief had lifted off of him, felt the ways that he could continue to honor his grandfather. His grandfather moved on. And so that circle closed. I remember a few years back, I was working in a pretty big agricultural area of northern Michigan, big hops country. And I had a gig there where I would stop by this artisanal malting farm. So they made malt for beer. And it was a bit in the startup phase. They were doing well, but it was definitely a lot of work at the time. And absolutely lovely people that ran it. A woman in particular, that was her business. And so my side gig job was to go into this huge vat filled with sprouting barley and basically stir it up with a shovel. It needed to get stirred twice a day so that the barley wouldn't clump together. It usually took about 2 hours. So it was self-paced. And basically the deal was I could do it whenever I wanted, as long as it happened, sometime in the morning. So usually when I was there, I might see somebody else for a minute, but usually I was there mostly by myself. And for a few weeks in a row, I kept catching this shadow in the window, right? And like the first few times I just thought it was a shadow, figured it was an animal or, the shadow from a tree or something. But after it happened a few times, I started to know, it was always in the same place. So I was like, oh, that must be something that's out there that's casting this shadow, even though it would happen in various times of the day. So I started going out there, like looking around, trying to track, like, what is it that I'm seeing in my peripheral? Yeah. And every time I would go out there, nobody else was around. There wasn't a tree. It just didn't seem clear what was causing it. So I started checking my body during those times and started to have a feeling like, well, I did, to be honest, I had a feeling from the get-go that it was like a ghost or a spirit. I could tell the first time I caught it in my periphery that it felt like that was true. But of course, my mind would come in and question it. And I'm going to make that the last resort, not the first thing. So from then, whenever I would feel its presence, um, which to me sort of felt like almost like just this touch of heaviness, or that feeling like somebody was looking at you, when you can't see it, but somebody's watching you. So when I would feel its presence, I would acknowledge it, right? I'd say hello, and basically also try to mind my own business and show it that I wasn't a threat. Um, and even though it didn't feel completely compassionate, it was clear it wasn't a threat to me. So I just let it be. So finally, one day I was talking to the owner, and I guess I happened to mention it. I don't really remember how it came up, but I happened to mention it. And I said it kept happening, and I knew it was an old property, and I was curious if she, happened to know anything about the history of the property. Well, it turns out it was her partner's mother, who had also passed away a few years prior, and most definitely was keeping an eye on the place, and also had some unfinished business. So she wasn't hostile, but she was a little fiery, And I remember my friend also at that time saying like, oh my God, it's crazy that you could feel that, because they were aware, but that's because, they were living in that house and they were so intimately connected to it. And here again, I think it served as a validation because they felt like she was there. But most people would feel like they're crazy when they feel that, especially if there's not like undeniable signs. So from there, I was able to drop a little bit more info about what I could read from the situation, and what might be helpful for them and for, the ghost, his mother, to find some closure. So I often suggest when you're growing your spiritual gift, you talk about them, not to show other people that you have them, not to convince them that your gift is real or something you're seeing is real, but just share about what you're experiencing. Because without this, they might have missed the opportunity to be validated for themselves and heal some of this loss and grief. I also might have missed out on the opportunity to be validated on what I was feeling and experiencing. I might have always kind of wondered if I was just making it up. And when you're tuned in, you'll pick up on things like this. You might know when someone has passed, or even though you're not there present with them. And one thing with this kind of gift, and the same is true with entity work, which is different, very different, is that if you are predisposed to be a psychopomp or see ghosts, there's also a way that you are going to, like, this is the gift in the shadow. So the gift is that you're called to do this work. The shadow is that what might happen is that you will actually project part of yourself externally in the form of ghosts. So again, just kind of continuing to keep the theme of the cycles and that we're coming from different places. If you're the kind of person that sees ghosts everywhere and is always pointing out ghosts, it might be time for you to do some inner work, to look inward, and to pause and reflect on whether pointing out the ghosts is serving the situation or not. Or is it causing a situation where there's actually, you're creating fear, or creating a situation where you can come in and then save somebody? That's the distortion of the gift. On the other side, and I find more people are like this, if you have a tendency to feel and notice things from folks that are in between being alive and passing all the way through to the other side, what you might be called to do now is actually share some of that, where you might be inward with it a lot and feel uncomfortable sharing it. So just keeping that in mind, I always try to evaluate that when I'm sharing things that are of the spiritual nature, especially with people that maybe didn't ask me to share anything, right? Is this for me or for them that I feel called to share this? And if it's for them, do I have permission from spirit and permission from them? Anyway, on the flip side, so oftentimes folks will have another some concerns about getting deeper into the spiritual work because they probably had direct interactions with spirits or ghosts when they were kids. And of course, that shit is scary. And it's really fascinating. So I was watching this show on highly sensitive children last winter. And the theme was about children who couldn't sleep because when night would fall, their antenna would pop on and they would just pick up all of this activity. It must have been terrible for the families. The children couldn't sleep, parents couldn't sleep. And it's from like the scared children are reacting to this unseen thing, that they can see, but nobody else can. Of course, terrifying for a parent. The parent would freak out. So it kind of just kept snowballing into this thing, right? Because it's like there was no explanation. And what was really fascinating about the way that the professionals were helping these children is the method that they would use to heal the fear from the children. And so what that was is they actually brought the children to a place that was known to be haunted, where there was regular known activity, and also where the professionals knew the history of that building. So what they did is had the children stay up at night, and they stayed with the children, and they had the little, sensor meters, and, when the children could feel the ghost in the room, they would usually show a physical sign, and the practitioners would encourage them to talk about it. What are you feeling right now? What are you noticing? And they would have their meters. So the kid would usually read it first. They would be aware that the ghost is in here. And the practitioners would validate them. Yes, this is real. This is happening. Here is proof. Okay. And here's ways to hold your boundary, right? Because it's less about protecting yourself from something that's evil and more about just having a clear boundary about, where the line is between you and them. And then would encourage them to talk about what they were noticing or what they were hearing from the spirits and validate that too. And that's actually what allowed the children to heal from the fear of what was happening. It wasn't by trying to make it not happen or make it go away or make the ghost go away, but actually just validating this is true, this is real, and this is how you can stay in your center in these situations. Fascinating. And it completely changed those children's lives. So yeah, but sometimes ghosts aren't actually other people. This is what's really fascinating. Sometimes we can even manifest ourselves as ghosts. As with all gifts, you have that conscious version and that wounded version, and they can shift back and forth between the two very quickly. We also have the capacity to send parts of our soul out into the past and the future. We store energy in this multidimensional way. So it is possible that when you're encountering a ghost, it could actually be a past life version of you. It's also possible that that ghost could actually be you from this life, a different part of you. So I was working with a client one day who was having a ghost in the house experience. She knew the age, she knew the gender. It was interacting in ways that were very physical and definitely messing with certain people when they would come visit. And she was getting to where she couldn't sleep at night. And she had also worked with ghosts before. So it was less, I think for her, it was less about the fear that the ghost was trying to do something to her and more just about it like interacting, like not allowing her to get rest. So she set something up so we could work through this. And I think the intention she had was to see if she could help it cross over. Now I've worked with ghosts before, so I can tell pretty quickly in my body if we're actually dealing with one or not. This one was fascinating because I could tell she wasn't making it up. And I could tell to some extent that it was a ghost, and that all the things she was saying was really happening. But it also didn't feel like an old ghost. And so as we dove into the work, it turns out that it was actually cast off part of her inner child, projected into the future and waiting there for her in this house with a message for her. And right, so this is part of that distortion from the gift, but also part of the gift. It was incredible to see her capacity to do this and her ability to receive that message. And after she received the message, what her inner child needed, the trick stopped after our work, and they both found peace. So the point is, ghosts are fascinating. And even though it can be complex working with them, ultimately what is happening is pretty simple. And of course, there's a big spectrum between, how much work is required and integral knowledge is required to help them cross over. Right. So, I know some people that do this work with roadkill. Whenever I pass that animal on the road, I always, say a prayer and ask it to cross over. Some people stop and give them little funerals, and of course, all the way to the other extreme where you can have a ghost that is actually meaning to cause some problems, that has such an attachment to not crossing over. Usually they aren't aware that they're actually dead, right? So that's the more extreme side of the situation, or the spectrum of what ghost work can look like. But I find more often than not, just like those children, when we have the tendency to think that we want to shut off the gifts to feel safe, actually validating the gifts is what gave them safety. And oftentimes the same is true for the ghosts, that what they actually want is just to be seen and heard. They have something they need to communicate. And so when we run in fear, they're not actually chasing us. They're just trying to communicate with us more. The point is they always have a purpose. Sometimes it's to open up your gifts, or sometimes it's to open the spiritual world to you. Sometimes it's to complete a contract or ancestral wounds. Sometimes it's to teach you how to have boundaries, or that you need to have boundaries. Ghosts, like many spirits, show up to teach you something that you currently have projected outside of yourself. Sometimes you might even come across a ghost of yourself showing up to haunt you until you give it the attention it deserves and hear what it's trying to say. Thanks for joining me today, and have a happy Halloween.
Welcome to today's Member Query episode, where we explore questions about spiritual paths, intuitive gifts, growing a spiritual business, and shamanism. Do you have a question for us? Send us a DM at Holton Healing Arts.
This is another question from one of our members of our private Facebook group, Leading with Spirit. And the question is, do you ever have to defend yourself during travel? And what do you take into other realms? And while this is certainly a big question, I want to give you just a couple of simple, straightforward pieces to help get you started or navigate this area in your practice. So as far as defending yourself during travel, first of all, when we're working in shamanic journey, most of the time, if you're working in the realms above the crown chakra or below the root chakra, or in other words, the upper and lower worlds, you're working in a realm of only in helping and compassionate spirits. So because you're in those areas, there is nothing that would need defended. And this is part of our practice also, is that the idea that we need defended from something often is what actually brings attack in the first place. Now, that being said, we're also our systems are operating and aware of basically infinite realities, right? Everything that is, was, or will be is all available and happening at this moment. And so it's entirely possible in your travels that you could access a point or place in time where you are quarreling with someone or something else. So one of the things that best helps you to defend from those moments is actually to go in and find the thing that will help complete the agreement that you have with the thing that you're fighting with. The other piece that can be helpful here is if you are traveling, again, in some of these in-between realms and you encounter other beings and you're unsure about them, one of the things that actually can also help as far as defending yourself is actually to practice good manners. And this is another thing that seems kind of straightforward and simple, but is really powerful. And I remember actually learning this in a particular practice with a student, and we had connected with a particular group of extraterrestrials. And it was a really potent experience. And when we first connected with them, there was a question, there was an issue at hand. And so when we went in there, we kind of went in there with like, hey, we want answers. And, and of course, they weren't very happy to receive us in that way. So we had to take a step back and think about what it would be like to have somebody just intrude in your house and start yelling, right? And so we had to take a step back, say hello, explain who we were, where we're coming from. And this brings me to the second part of this question, which, what do you take into other realms? And one thing that I love to do before I do any journey work or astral travel is to bring a gift with me. So this can be something that you actually hold physically in your hand before you travel, or it could be something that you pick up in your mind's eye. So I like to do something that comes to my mind's eye because usually the gift that I think of is connected to the journey that is ahead. And so maybe I might have, a trinket or a crystal or a seed or something pop into my head. And if it excites me, that's what I will pack, because I'll probably be meeting a spirit or be going to a land where that particular gift is needed or well received. Lastly, if you are encountering beings and you're not sure if they're benevolent or malevolent, a good practice for you to also use is to basically imagine your auric field or like a bubble around you. Most people like to work with a bubble of white light. What you would want to do is make sure that the outline, the external area of that bubble is very clear to you, so you can distinguish between what is your space and what is others. And of course, maintaining that boundary at all times, with a very gentle and soft vow to yourself that nobody comes into this space without your agreement.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Leading with Spirit. If you did, please share the link for this episode with your biggest takeaway, tagging me at Holton Healing Arts. It would also support me if you subscribed and left a rating and review of the show so we can support more people living their highest purpose. Until next time, journey on.